Welcome to Feminist Political Ecology Seminar's second session. First, some housekeeping details. This talk will be recorded and made available online later. The presentation portion will be recorded for this purpose. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A session, and those who would like to listen to the talk in Turkish can go to this word image on their Zoom application and press Turkish so that they can hear the Turkish translation. Türkçe çeviriyi dinlemek istiyorsanız Zoom application'daki Türkçe butonuna basmanız gerekiyor. Burada dünya işareti var. Orada Türkçe yazıyor. Ona basarsanız çevirmenleri duyabileceksiniz. As you may be aware, these webinars are being organized by Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics with the support of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. The seminars include the authors of articles that will appear in the upcoming issue of our journal on feminist political ecology. Our first speaker was Christine Barhart. Professor Barhart presented a critical feminist lens towards the Green New Deal, degrowth, and solidarity economies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Melissa Leach as our second guest in our series. Hi, Melissa. The title of her talk is Feminist Political Ecology and Historical Narratives, Implications for Pathways to Sustainability and Gender Justice. Melissa Leach is a social anthropologist and the director of University of Sussex Institute of Development Studies. Professor Leach co-founded and co-directed the ESRC STEPS Center from 2006 to 2014. She's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and the International Science Council's Committee on Science Planning. She's currently working on social dimensions of health and epidemics as co-leader of the Social Science in Humanitarian Action Platform and the Wellcome Trust-funded Pandemic Preparedness Project. She's a fellow of the British Academy and in 2017 was awarded a CBE for services to social science. Melissa Leach has carried out long-term ethnographic fieldwork in West Africa. Her research interests involve feminist perspectives on science and ecology, policies and public discourses, and debates around gender, sustainability, health, and development. Her publications on gender and environment include the books such as Rainforest Relations, Gender and Resource Use amongst the Mende of Gola, Sierra Leone, and Gender Relations and Sustainable Development. She's the lead author of the 2014 UN Women World Survey Report and the 2016 World Social Science Report on Challenging Inequalities. For our forthcoming issue, we will be translating Melissa Leach's 1996 article titled Gender and Environmental History from Representation of Women and Nature to Gender Analysis of Ecology and Politics. Today, Professor Leach will be drawing on and updating this article. Professor Leach will give an account of how diverse concepts and narratives about women, gender, and sustainability have emerged and coexisted. She's going to discuss how different conceptualizations of gender resulted in gendered outcomes of sustainability-focused policies and programs. Her presentation is very significant in terms of seeing the possible tensions between environmental protection and women's interests in different contexts and problems concerning the representation of women as environmental saviors or environmental victims. Her nuanced approach to the relationship between gender equality and sustainability requires us to carefully examine the trade-offs concerning the relation between these two different but intertwined goals. In her work, Professor Leach emphasizes the importance of creation of opportunities of spaces where we can learn from diverse pathways, and hopefully we will all together create such a collective space tonight. Thank you again, Professor Leach, for being with us today, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Özlem, Zeynep, and your colleagues for organizing this wonderful series, to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation for supporting them, and for inviting me to be part of it. Let me apologize for having to present in English. I wish I could engage with you in Turkish, but I hope you will forgive. And what I want to do today, if I can just find my presentation, is share a little bit about where some of my work around feminist political ecology has come from over the last few decades. Because as the introduction showed, I've worked on quite a lot of things. I bring anthropological and social perspectives to health and sustainability challenges, but an interest in gender justice and then in feminist political ecology as a really important analytical approach has always run through all of my work. But this talk provided an opportunity to look back as well as to look forward. So, hang on a minute, just, oh, this is not moving on. Wait a minute. Sorry, I'm not sharing properly. There we go. So, as has been said, the article that was chosen for translation is actually quite an old one. It was published in 1996 and then the full version in 1997, at a particular moment. And this is the argument that Kathy Green, who was a student of mine, and I put forward then. We were particularly focused on colonial environmental history. And what we found was that much of that had been gender blind, in the sense that it really ignored women's and gender differentiated experiences. Being gender blind actually meant being male biased. In a sense, history was being told from the perspectives of men, and often the men who were more powerful in their societies. But at that time, we saw also some very different histories coming into view. And these were being told from an ecofeminist perspective. So works like Vandana Shiva's account of forests in India, or Esther Boserup's account of the decline of female farming in Africa, told a very different story. It was a story, a narrative that said at the beginning, relationships between women and nature were close, they were valued, they were productive, but they have been dominated and ultimately destroyed by patriarchal science and by colonial political economies, leading to the simultaneous decline of both feminine principles and ecology. So damage to women's interests, damage to ecologies had gone hand in hand. And those were a powerful set of accounts. Some problems with them. Partly they were very generalizing. They gave big sweeps of history without looking at much detail. They were often essentializing in their categories. They treated all women as if they were the same, as if men were non-existent or didn't appear. And women were presented as an identical group, ignoring differences between them, perhaps by class, by age, by place, by ethnicity, by race. And perhaps most of all, at that time, our argument was that they supported policy agendas which could be quite regressive and actually bad for women. And the 1990s were a time when policy arenas were spawning approaches called women, environment and development. These were, the shorthand was WED, and they built on approaches to women in development, which were really about looking at things from a women-centered point of view and adding women in to kind of neoliberal development paths without really questioning those. And what happened with wed agendas was that they often drew on these eco-feminist narratives to present women as the natural carers for the environment and ecology. And that in turn meant that women were often lumped with the task of looking after the environment in addition to all their other caring roles. So in the 1990s, we saw projects which assumed that women would plant the trees, look after the water resources, along with caring for their families. And that led to this double image that women were often the sustainability saviors, although we didn't use that term at that time, or they were victims because when the environment was destroyed, so were women's abilities to fulfill these roles. And this we felt was oversimplistic and sometimes dangerous because it gave women responsibility for saving the environment without questioning whether they had the resources, the labor availability to do it, and without sharing those roles with men. Instead, we suggested that a different approach to environmental history, grounded in the concepts of feminist political ecology and of gender analysis, would pay much more attention to relationships of labor, of property, of power between women and men, between different groups of women, and the ways that those interacted with the details of ecology and environmental processes. And if we looked at those things more carefully and with more attention, we'd be in a better position both to understand environmental change and to assess policy options. So that was the sort of argument of that article summarized. And we concluded, though, at the point at which I'd like to sort of really take off for today's reflections, because what we also argued was that all historical accounts and narratives are in some ways representations. They're not just kind of neutral accounts of historical events as they unfolded. They are always, as are all histories, constituted and told by particular people from particular positions. They tell history in a way that suits the moment and often suits the interests or the institutional outlooks of those who tell them. So it is that men's histories, those colonial histories, uphold the power of those male interests, to be simple. And in turn, perhaps one should see those eco-feminist accounts as just one kind of historical narrative, which are quite useful perhaps in upholding those women-centered sustainability savior agendas, or perhaps in constructing a coherent image of female solidarity. But in turn, the kind of approach that we put forward, a more nuanced gender analysis of historical events, gives a very different kind of narrative, which in turn would support rather different policies and actions. So if we recognize histories as always partial narratives, then we can think about a plurality of them and the pathways that they support. And so my interest today is to help us think about how, what kinds of histories one might want to tell from a feminist political ecology lens, or indeed from a new feminist political ecology lens. And I'll come on to what I mean by that in a moment. And what kinds of representations of their own environmental histories might diverse women and the social movements and struggles they might be forging want to tell. So that's my kind of interest and perhaps where we might want to go. But first of all, we have to fast forward 25 years because the kinds of issues that Kathy Green and I flagged in that article have also changed. Events have changed, and environmental and ecological challenges have changed. I think we're now in a world that I often term one of intersecting global challenges. So these are just some. We've got climate and environmental change going on in a way that it really was not to the same extent in 1997. We've got health challenges which often interact with those of ecology. The COVID pandemic has shown those. We've got inequalities of many kinds, yes, gender inequalities, but much more awareness and indeed intensification of other kinds of intersections with economic, political, social, race-based, religious inequalities and others. We've got crises linked to conflict and displacement. We've got disruptions in the digital world, which bring opportunities for some, but threats to others. And in many countries, we've got new forms of authoritarian politics, changing the spaces in which civil society and movements can operate. And I would suggest that Turkey is probably one of the countries which is experiencing this right now, as indeed in different ways. My own country in the UK is. So this is a different world, I think, in which feminist political ecologists need to think. We've also got a rather different policy agenda, certainly from the 1990s, where we're thinking hard about sustainable development. Less than 10 years to go to meet the global goals, a recognition of these 17 different goals and their many indicators, but also of the interconnections between them. And as I've been arguing with colleagues, sustainable development and gender equality are very much connected with each other. Gender equality is goal 5, but as I'll argue a little bit further, it's also a central goal. It can't sit aside from these other sustainable development goals. And then we've also, of course, got an updated set of feminist analyses. This is a very, very short outline history of some forms of feminist thinking about ecologies. And as I've suggested, they run through from the debates of the 70s and 80s, which emphasized women and development, women, environment and development, those WED approaches, that idea of integrating women into existing development paths. We had those eco-feminist approaches, which saw women as naturally, or in some versions, ideologically close to nature. And that emphasis on the relationships between patriarchy and ecological destruction going together. We then, though, had what came to the fore much more in the 90s, these gender and development approaches and their counterparts in gender, environment and development, which looked harder at gender relations, at power, at resource access and control, the kind of perspective that the article that's been translated looked at. And they, of course, connected with feminist political ecologies, their 1990s versions, which one way of understanding those fused feminist political economy with some of the critiques of science and gendered knowledge. So we had those coming togethers of feminist knowledge, feminist politics around ecological relations. But then some additions. I think feminist political ecology has been really strengthened by the attention in the 2000s to intersectional feminisms, which look not just at gender, but at the ways they interact with class, age, place, ethnicity, sexuality, and also with the renewed attention to bodies as well as voice. Some of those things are now part of what the new feminist political is often cast as a new feminist political ecology, which has paid much more attention to embodied knowledge and practice, and to the ways that these feminist ecological relations are not just set as part of rules and institutions, but are also performed in practice. And then I think even more in the last few years, the 2020s, if you like, we're seeing the intersection too with post-humanist and beyond the human perspectives, which are interested in the connections between human and non-human nature, the webbed relations and networks that are part of everybody's connections with ecologies. And I think this has given the opportunity to resurface some of those ecofeminist ideas and actions, but perhaps in a way that's less sweeping and generalizing and more open to seeing how they play out in diverse ways in different places and in different parts of the world. So if that's a very short, updated history, what I'm now interested in is what kinds of historical narratives might we see now in the 2020s, and what do they tell us about the sustainable development policy agendas that feminist actors might want to pursue? So the policy agendas, I think, come into focus if we think now about gender equality as a basic part of sustainable development. And this was the argument that colleagues and I made with UN Women in 2014, when we led the World Survey on the role of women in development. And at that time, we argued that the interactions between sustainable development and gender equality were inextricable. They were completely entwined. But although there were some synergies, there were ways in which gender equality and sustainable development could be pursued together, and it was really important to look for those. We also had to beware of some of the tensions and the trade-offs between approaches in policy and action that foregrounded gender and perhaps women's interests, but also those of ecology, and sometimes they didn't work together. So the challenge is to build pathways of change that avoid the negative and build the positive. And to do that, we began to explore what I'll now share with you is some slightly different, you could call them historical narratives. They're historical in the sense that they describe pathways of change. They're kind of mini histories, but they don't necessarily go far back. They're as it were, histories in the present. They're histories of what is happening now. So here are some very, very short stories. One might be around Maasai women in Kenya who are struggling now to produce their crops and to graze their animals and to find and produce food for their families amidst climates that are drying, and on lands which are often squeezed by commercial developments and land grabs. Some of those land grabs are being undertaken with a green agenda. So parts of these Maasai lands are now subject to conservation and to protection of wildlife and of nature. But often the way that that is done is about preserving nature, a certain image of wildness and wildlife, which is at the same time doing violence to the relationships and the livelihoods and the connections that are so important to gendered ecologies on which people and families are surviving. So that's a narrative about the tensions and the trade-offs perhaps between a particular version of green becoming a green grab that is squeezing out gendered justice and ecologies. Another narrative takes us to Egypt and to urban settings, where the vital care work that women of different ages, and often helped by boys and young men too, are compromised when water is contaminated and basic services aren't within reach. So there are synergies to be built, but the synergies are not based on seeing women as sustainability saviors and simply assuming that they will take on the role of care and walking ever further, or somehow trying to find that clean water. It's about a narrative that requires state agencies and a contract between citizens and the state to help provide some of those basic services. It's not women who are sustainability saviors. It's about contracts between states and citizens, and supporting those enabling caring connections. Or take us to India, where a rural example might look at forest user groups, where there's been a lot of research and activism done since that time when Vandana Shiva was portraying the Chipko movement as a demonstration of the intrinsic connections between women and the feminine principle in ecology. What we see now is that there certainly are examples where women's involvement is helping to render landscapes greener, richer in resources, richer in biodiversity, richer now in the concerns with climate change mitigation, while also satisfying the needs of people and communities for fuel and for food. But, and there's a big but, this happens well only when women have rights over resources, where they have control over their labor power, and where they are part of forest user groups. And the research that has shown that a threshold of at least 30% of women's involvement in the decision-making about these forest user groups is really important to ensure that these synergies between gender justice and indeed the ecological values of these groups happen, has been really important. Where women are not involved, you tend to get the user groups not working well, and indeed less impact in ecological terms as well as in gender justice terms. Or turn to urban areas, again in India, where the latest craze is waste to energy, which is arguably both supporting waste management and also green energy. And carbon financing and carbon credits are helping to support waste to energy plants. But again, many of these are proving to be environmentally unsound, but also to compete for the use of waste with many hundreds of thousands across India's cities of waste pickers who rely on recycling trash and waste for their livelihoods. These waste pickers are not just women, many of them are men. They tend to be experiencing these intersecting inequalities around marginalization on caste and class lines. But here, really important synergies can be built between justice, livelihoods of waste pickers and ecology by building much more on waste as a commons and supporting livelihoods and gender justice, rather than relying on these top-down waste to energy plants. So those are some little stories, historical narratives, if you like, which are about intersecting inequalities, tackling them in ways that build synergies between gender justice and sustainable development. They provide perhaps grounds, this kind of narrative provides grounds for redefining sustainable development with gender at its heart. So what we did in that World Survey report was to say sustainable development is economic, social, and environmental development that ensures human well-being and dignity, ecological integrity, and gender equality and social justice now and into the future. And we defined gender equality and justice in substantive terms. This is about rights, it's about resources, and argued that it was partly a matter of ethics and morality and fairness and justice, that gender justice in society is a moral value to aim at, that we should be getting behind. But it's also a practical matter, because gender inequalities could work against the meeting of other goals in sustainable development. They could contribute to negative tensions and trade-offs. And so coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals, this is where we argued that Goal 5 around gender equality and indeed Goal 10 around reducing inequality more generally, which is now, I think, following the perspectives in the World Social Science Report in 2016. Inequality is not just an economic thing, it's also about social, cultural, knowledge, and political determinants, and gender inequalities are part and parcel of other inequalities. But these are central to all other goals. If we haven't got greater equity and equality, we find that other sustainable goals, development goals, are really compromised. And that includes the environmental ones, goals 6, 7, 11 to 15, 17, as well as other goals around health and nutrition, around poverty, around conflict and access to justice. So the World Social Science Report contains a lot of examples of how these intersections work, and actually of what needs to be done to support pathways that are about both equity and justice and sustainability. So this is where the idea of pathways comes into being. So since doing that work with Kathy all those decades ago, I've spent quite a bit of time in between working with colleagues in the STEPS Centre and partners around the world in our Pathways to Sustainability Consortium to reflect on and try to build in an action-oriented way pathways towards both sustainability and social justice, and to recognize that pathways, as we define them, are different routes of change and intervention. They're often supported by narratives, including historical narratives, and they're always entwined with politics and power. And we've recognized in work like this book about green transformations, that they often involve some quite fundamental restructuring of systems, because many of our pathways are really unsustainable as well as really unjust. And if we want to move towards sustainability and social justice, we're often needing to build alternative pathways and to really forward the alternative narratives that can support them. One little diagram which perhaps captures this, and this idea of a gendered pathway to sustainability and some of the questions that you might want to ask, is captured in this slightly complicated diagram. So here over on the right-hand side, we've got the recognition that the world's part of, it's made up of complex, often very dynamic realities as social, economic, political, technological, ecological processes interact. And then we've got kind of in the middle, different kinds of systems. And a pathway, in a way, cuts through the middle, but we have to recognize the implication of gender at many different points. So over on the left-hand side, gender issues and the concerns of feminist political ecology come up in the narratives, the stories that we tell about what we might like to happen. So systems are always open to different framings with different values, and we can tell gender differentiated narratives about what we might see happening, the different kinds of stories that I, like the examples I indicated. We can also think in the middle here about gendered institutional arrangements, and this is where the kinds of questions feminist political ecologists might be asking about decision-making, about land, about labor, about control over resources, about interactions with particular ecological relations and processes, how connected they are or how disconnected they are, come into being. And in turn, over on the right-hand side, the ways these institutional arrangements play out will shape who gains and who loses, gender differentiated goals and outcomes, synergies or perhaps tensions and trade-offs with ecological change, environmental change of different kinds. One example which perhaps comes from my own work and perhaps draws out the way one might think about pathways, emphasizes how they can be built often from the grassroots and from the bottom up. And I've been very interested in my work in these kind of details of how women and men in all their diversity interact with ecologies, very much at the grassroots. So one area of research that colleagues of mine in Sierra Leone, in Guinea, Liberia have been involved in was a project about soils. And a really important part of it was informed by the concerns of the new feminist political ecology. And what we found when we looked in the forest zone at the soils around people's settlements were some rather significant, but perhaps quite surprising narratives, because women in these villages would say things like, God made the soil, but we made it fertile. And what they would refer to were the everyday practices which encoded their embodied knowledge and their agency in managing household waste, which involved often throwing the ash from cooking fires, the waste from processing rice and palm oil and vegetables in women's kitchens, which they would throw as trash behind their villages. And they would find that the soil that built up there would be very deep, would be very black and very rich, and over time could become very deep. So within a decade, you'd get these rings of deep black anthropogenic soil building up behind people's villages. Now, they were very valuable economically in the gendered and feminized political economy and ecology of these villages, where it was important for particularly young wives and women in marriages who needed to support their children to have an independent source of income. And that often came from gardening and from growing vegetables, horticultural crops, which they would then sell in local markets to get money that they'd use to feed children, to pay school fees, and to do the things that they couldn't or wouldn't rely on male relatives to produce. So independent income was in turn important to women's relations in their communities. But there was also a symbolic and an embodied way in which women talked about the fertility of these soils in ways that also made allusions to their own fertility, to their reproductive fertility as women. Both are connected in the understandings in this region with ideas of blackness, of oiliness, elaborated in the masking rituals and the notions of embodied female fertility that the initiation societies in this area put forward. And women would talk very actively about the connectivity between their care for soils and their care within their reproductive roles for children. Now, this is not to say that these are somehow natural and intrinsic, but they were part of everyday relationships in which women would negotiate their roles with men and with others in their communities. So connected narratives about soil care, fertility, and economy and autonomy were really important here. And those narratives were very, very different from two others that we saw applied to these self-same soils. So one of them was a narrative that said these black soils are really rich in carbon, and it's now important for them to be valued and conserved because of their contribution to climate change mitigation. Now, that's not a problem. And there were ways in which biochar projects, which were bringing improved cook stoves and charring to create extra char and bury them and bring carbon credits to pay for the cost of doing so were actually quite valuable to women. They were sometimes bringing resources to communities, but that narrative about climate change mitigation was pretty irrelevant. This was not what was driving women's own engagement in creating rich Black soils. But there was another narrative which really conflicted with women's own narratives here, and that is the idea that soils are naturally fertile, and that preserving and protecting soil fertility, and indeed restoring what were often seen to be degraded soils in this region, requires fertilizers, external industrial fertilizers. This was a narrative about soil degradation and its replenishment through fertilizer. And that one sat completely at odds with this rather different sustainable development path, which was coming from ideas of Black soil and feminized agency in helping to protect it. So that's some sort of localized examples of how one might think from the bottom up about pathways. Our argument was that by working better with women's knowledge and with their economic and ecological interests, you could actually build pathways around these ideas of ideas and practices of soil fertility, which ultimately would be more sustainable and more socially and gender just. But we can also scale up, because of course the scale of these global challenges doesn't mean that they can be solved through tiny located grassroots examples. They can add up, but that's not all. We are also in a world now where international agreements, where government commitments and policies are going to be really important, and where social movements, from those operating in local settings at the grassroots or in cities, to global levels, which are connecting struggles from different places up together, in things like the food sovereignty movement, or Slum and Shack Dwellers International, connecting up urban movements in different places, or something like the Green Belt movement, which is connecting located rural feminized struggles around land and trees up across the world, are going to be really important. So I think on the one hand, it is important to pay attention to located pathways and to recognize how these can add up, how big change can happen by adding up small change and building transformative pathways from the bottom and through connections between them. But that in turn can link up with the intercoupling of feminist and environmental politics, translocally and then nationally and globally, towards these more sustainable and just futures. And at all these scales, to come back to history and narratives, they have value in helping sometimes to contest dominant power relations, to point out the problems and the tensions that can exist between powerful pathways, and also to justify those alternatives that might help us build better synergies between gender justice and sustainable development paths themselves. So this is where some of my thoughts have got to, but I think the big interest now, I think a lot of the energy in both sustainable development and in feminist movements that now do lie with activism and with social movements. So one of the areas I'd be incredibly interested to discuss with all of you in your different settings is how we can better use feminist political ecology analysis to connect with activist agendas and also with policy agendas in the new and very challenging worlds of environment and sustainable development in which we find ourselves. So thank you very much. I'm much looking forward to questions and discussion.